Welcome, everyone. My name is Michelle Booth, and I'm the chairperson of the South African National Association of Arts Therapists, SANATA. And I'm very happy to have Tammy Gordon, who is the arts therapy representative on the board that represents arts therapists at the Health Professions Council. And this morning we are talking about the Health Professions Council and her role there, just so that we can understand and get clarity on the relationship that she has there with the arts therapists, with SANATA. And so welcome, Tammy.
Thank you, Michelle.
So the first question I have is, why do arts therapists need to be registered with the Health Professions Council?
Okay, so as we all know that once we are qualified, we need to register. Like any health profession that is regulated under the auspices of the council, we have to register in order to practice legally in our country. It is illegal to practice without registration because there is a law that governs any health professional under the auspices of the council. And not only for that, but also to A, protect the public, and B, to ensure that we are gaining the support we need to have in our professions. One should register with council.
And just say a little bit more about what is the Health Professions Council in its broadest sense, and the board that represents arts therapists. What is that board called, and how do we fit? How did we end up there?
So the Health Professions Council is made up of 12 professional boards. And how council works is that there's a sort of a part of council which is your secretariat or your administrative function, and those are permanent employees of council. And then every board has a administrative head and secretariat under that head. And then what makes up the rest of that board are members from the professions who are nominated to sit on those boards and are appointed by the minister. So, Minister of Health. So, essentially, the work on the board, the majority of sort of the meat of the work is done by the volunteers, the members of that board, supported by the Secretariat. So we are one of those 12 boards, and we are the board of occupational therapy, medical orthotics and prosthetics, and arts therapy. I think that originally what sort of transpired was that the arts therapies traditionally had sat very close to occupational therapy in commonly in international practice. And from experience of sitting on this board, the members of the board are incredibly open. And I think that perhaps it was quite an open, welcoming space for the arts therapies that had support from members in the board. And that's how we came to register on this particular board and be part of this particular board. So that's how, essentially.
Thanks. I'm going to ask you just now about what your role as the arts therapy rep is there just now. How long have we as arts therapists been registered by the Health Professions Council?
So what would have initially happened is that we would have not necessarily had all of our regulations in place. That takes quite a long time to be processed. But what I understand is that we piggybacked off of the occupational therapy category for some time in order to allow individuals coming back into the country to register and be regulated. And so that the first person to register under that category was in 1986. So there's a long history with the OCP board. And then slowly but surely with representation, we would have started to develop the very specific regulations and apply for our own category of registration, which would have had to gone through the ministry and be approved, which obviously all happened. But it's been a long history of being recognized by council and being a part of the OCP board.
So what I understand from other countries is that we actually are kind of ahead in terms of our regulatory recognition for our professions. But obviously there's a lot of advocacy still to be done to spread that awareness and recognition kind of into broader sectors of our society and even with the other health professions. Isn't that right?
That I think absolutely. Yeah. So I think on one hand, we can be incredibly proud of how far we have come and what we have achieved and the presence that we do have in council, in our communities, in organizations. And at the same time, we acknowledge that this is an ongoing work that needs to be done. And I continue to advocate and pave the way for the arts therapies.
So that brings us to your role at the HPCSA. Are you an advocating person there? How do you represent the arts therapies there? That's a really important question for us to understand. And is there only one of you there? And why is there only one?
So there is only one of me on the board, the only Arts Therapies representative. Representation is congruent with the amount of practitioners you have registered in the country.
Okay.
So, for example, there are possibly, I stand to be corrected, but over 1,000 OTs currently registered in South Africa. And so it's proportional to that, the amount of OTs on the board. We are the smallest profession on our board, and thus we have one representative. So my role is, it's a complex one, and I wouldn't say that it's entirely devoid of advocacy, but I don't think that's the main premise and the main position I need to assume. I'm very much a member of the board, and so my responsibility is not only to the arts therapies, but to the other professions represented on the board too. So I need to be mindful, cognizant, understanding everything that affects all three professions. Obviously, I represent the arts therapies, so I speak for the arts therapies on the board, but my participation has to be for all three, because I have to comment, I have to engage, I have to really play my role as a member of that board. So as the arts therapies representative, I sit on all the committees of the board. Now, the board is broken, it's working, it's functioning, it's broken into a number of committees to do the work of the board. So every member on the board does the work. The members do the work because we are the ones that can speak to anything from our professions, whereas the secretariat doesn't have the knowledge of the profession. So they can't, obviously over a number of years, they gain the knowledge of the profession, but they can't speak to the profession. They can't input into documents and data what needs to be put in there. So we have to speak for our professions and represent in every way. So we have an education and training committee. We have the board committee, which is every member is on that committee, obviously. We have the executive committee. We have the Committee of Preliminary Inquiry, which manages all of the complaints that come into council against professionals related to our board. We have the Committee of Professional Practice. And so I sit on all of those committees, and all of the task teams for specific projects that come out of those committees. And each committee sits to about, depending on the committee, 3 to 4 times a year. There is also the internship committee, which is a committee underneath a subcommittee of the education committee. And that was really put in place because medical orthotics and prosthetics and arts therapies have internships. So we needed to create a committee that really spoke to the work of the interns. Yeah, so I'm also the chairperson of the internship committee, and the chairperson of the committee then is responsible for all of the, for driving the committee, for holding the committee, for managing the agenda with the secretariat, for just ensuring that the committee's work is done. You hold the committee. So in my role, then I'm sitting on each of those committees. And even if it doesn't necessarily, for example, in preliminary inquiry, even if there isn't an arts therapies case, I have to be ready to engage with every other case that comes the way of the committee.
Wow, so that's a lot of work, Tammy.
It's a lot of work. It's a lot of work. And but it's good work. And there's a great sense of community on the board, a great sense of camaraderie, of support. So it's a really good board to be in, because I feel like everybody has everybody's profession's best interests at heart. And that's really what you want, because if anything's going to move forward, that's what you need. You need a supportive space within which to exist, not one that's challenging you or confronting you or rubbing against you, but actually one that just wants you to grow. And my experience in the last 7 years has been exactly that, has just been incredible support to grow. And so I feel that it's a really good place to be. And so then to just give you a bit of a sense, so each of those committees, like I said, has its own work, right? So out of the board committee, for example, a task team might be established that we need to review every single document that the board has. And we have multiple guidelines, probably in the region of about 200 guidelines between all the professions. Now, every 5-year term, those guidelines need to be reviewed. We need to make sure that they are in keeping with current practice, that they speak to the professions. So then we would sit and we would review every document. So you see, that's where it becomes important that you have a representative that understands and can respond from the perspective of the profession, because that then you would need to be able to do that. So in the last couple of years, we have reviewed our minimum standards of training, for example. In those instances, sometimes I also need additional support because I can't fund from each of the 4 modalities, because I know my modality incredibly well. I have a generally good sense of the other modalities, but not specific enough. And so then sometimes I co-opt people onto task teams out of our professional base to support me in those processes. So it's quite intricate, and it's I imagine it like a little tree, with the branches going out, where maybe perhaps the representative is like the stem, and then really just needs to reach out to members community and the profession to support some of the work. But every inquiry about the arts therapies in relationship to council comes to me. Every needing to support our practitioners on a daily basis around varying questions about council, their relationship to council, their issues with registration, they want to register. Sometimes quite often we have foreign qualified professionals who are returning from overseas and need to write their board exams. That all comes from me. I would coordinate those board exams. So it's a daily engagement. It's not something that happens, sporadically. It's a daily engagement. It's an ongoing engagement. And then, of course, with relationship to advocacy, of course, my ears and eyes are always open, and there is a part of my role. So if there's an opportunity to ensure that we are represented in particular spaces or in ministry, spaces, for example, Department of Health, if there's an opportunity to piggyback on something or to be present, then I'm always advocating for our space in those places. We need to be present and witnessed and understood in council, then I'm advocating for that. So, of course, there's a level of advocacy that does come into play.
Thank you. You mentioned being there for 7 years, but there's a 5-year term. So you're in a second term, are you, at the moment? Okay.
So yes.
So
yeah.
could you maybe tell us something about, what has been achieved in your previous term and, currently, so that we can get a sense of, what also the time that it takes to do things. I think that's something that would be helpful for our members as well as other people to understand the slow wheels that happen there.
Yeah, so any member of the boards can do 2 terms, okay. And only 2 terms. My choice to stand for another term was very much based on the fact of that slow-moving wheel. So much of the foundational work of a lot of the things that we kind of prioritized as a profession on the board, we started to do so much of that work in my first term, but I didn't quite see it into fruition in the first term because of the slow-moving nature of the beast. And so I felt it really important to come into a second term with all of that knowledge, with the process at hand, with understanding how things work.
And the relationships.
And the relationships.
So, yeah.
It was the right decision. So not only does the generally the Department of Health take quite a significant amount of time to process any form of gazette or to promulgate any gazette that arrives on the minister's desk. But council itself has its own very bureaucratic structure around how any regulation guideline is moved through the varying layers. So any document that you create, any regulation you're working on in any one of those committees, because you can understand that anything related to education gets done in the education committee. Anything related to something else gets done in another committee. Has to be worked on and go through that committee. Then it has to go to the board committee of our board. And then it has to be ratified in that committee. If it's something that needs to have further ratification, then it goes to council committee. And the council committee is essentially a committee made up of all of usually the chairpersons, but not always, of the varying boards. A chairperson can also nominate or ask someone else to sit on council committee for them. So that's quite a slow process if you're only meeting 3 to 4 times in a year per committee, because generally round robining of any kind of major guideline or regulation is not permissible. Sometimes we can speed up the process of ratification of something through round robin, but it depends what it really is. And I mean email round robin, because obviously in between meeting, we can communicate in that way. So that's a slow moving process internally, but you have to follow process and protocol, because should there ever be any recourse, you have to be able to show that you followed the right steps, that it went through all of the procedures that it's meant to go through, and so on and so forth. Also, if it's a legal document like a gazette, then your legal team at council has to become part of that process. And they write it into a gazette, and then you can imagine any kind of document goes back and forth, back and forth, back and forth until the practitioners are happy with how it reads, how it looks, etc. So I suppose when you're dealing with matters of law, it does takes time for things to be processed.
And I understand, sorry, that things like agenda items can only be added how many weeks before, and if you've missed that deadline, then that's it. You have to wait for the next meeting, which could be 3-4 months later. Is that right?
Yeah. So generally, I mean, I can try my best to get an agenda item on late, but for the most part, because of the nature of these meetings and the amount of preparation a member has to do, I mean, if you can imagine every profession having multiple items on an agenda and the background information that you have to have per item, and we all have to read all of that background before we come into a meeting, because you have to understand what's going on, and so you can respond, and there's no time in the scope of a meeting to start reading documents. So you need to get that agenda out to members, at least 2 weeks a week at the minimum before a meeting, so that we can prepare. So you have to have your agenda item submitted well in advance so that these massive document packs can be collated by the Secretariat. It's an enormous job. It's an enormous job for the Secretariat. So, I mean, you asked me, Mish, about some of the things that we've achieved over this last few terms. So I think there's been many things, but I think if I could point out just a few of the things that I think have been significantly important. Obviously, so when I arrived on the board, we were tasked, because now it was the beginning of this new term, that we all had to sit and review our scopes of profession. And so unbeknownst to me, I didn't, and it took me time to learn all of this jargon and how everything works on board and council. But our existing at that time scope of profession had never been really moved past a bit of a draft format into a gazette that had been promulgated. So that was a bit of an alarm bell moment, because we understand that what actually protects any profession on the board and the public is the existence of your scope, which is what are you entitled to do in your profession. So it's possibly one of the most important documents that we would have, actually. So we set in motion beginning to work on that scope, and that took pretty much my entire first term. We set up a task team so that every one of our modalities were represented. We rewrote the scope. It goes then back into the board for ratification, for feedback. It then gets put into a legal document, a gazette written in legalese, which is so different to what the original document looked like, with all its detail and whatever. It's now a 3-page document, because that's what a scope of profession looks like. And it has to be very brief, very to the point. That's how it needs to read. And so basically that back and forth took many years. Within my last term as well, then once it's finally in that document and we're like, okay, it's good to go, then it has to go through every single board, has to have an opportunity, every board on council, all of the 12, have to have an opportunity to respond to your scope. And only once you've got all 12 boards saying, okay, good to go, can it then go to council to be signed off, to go to the ministry, to be signed by the minister and promulgated. We did have some complications in that process, where one of the boards wasn't particularly happy with what we had put in. We needed to have a meeting to discuss some of those complexities. We had to set up another task team to deal with the complexities of that issue, and then we sent it through again. And then it actually got sent to the ministry this year, well, towards the end of last year, but very much this year, and actually it's just been signed off. by the ministry. Now it goes out for public comment. So anyone in the public can comment on it. If there are any requests or questions, it will come back to the board. And then we'll, sort of go in a process of ratification again. So I think that process kind of shows you the intensity and the amount of work just for one of the documents. One of those core documents. I think another really, for me, like really successful kind of thing we've put into place. So obviously, there's also been a big focus on ensuring that our training programs are starting to be accredited and happening, because we need people to be able to train locally, nationally, and it's imperative for the development of our profession in South Africa. And so as I came onto the board, we were finishing the process of ensuring that drama therapy was gazetted, that it was included as a category, that WITS as a institution was included, that the internship for the drama therapists was established, that the internship category of registration was created. All these categories of registration all require the same amount of promulgation as a scope of practice. So you can imagine it's an equal amount of work. And then, of course, the big thing was art therapy. There were 2 potential trainings, master's programs on the table in my last term. I wanted to see those into fruition. When a program or a university applies to be evaluated by council, that too is a process. They have to submit a lot of documentation. An evaluation team has to be established by council, by the board. We then have to go out and evaluate that program. Reports have to be written. That also has to go through the board, then to council, then for ratification once it's approved. So it's a big process, but we've managed to accredit or evaluate 2 Masters in Art Therapy programs. One which has already started and another one which is set to start in 2024. So that's an enormous achievement to have those 2 programs, particularly for art therapy, because there's such a demand for training in art therapy in this country.
Yeah, that is true.
Yeah. And I think, there is a lot, but I think for me also what has been core and really important, having been a person that trained overseas and came back to have to register with council and figure one's way through all of that sort of process, it was important to me that we really refined what that looked like for returning graduates. And so we reimagined the foreign qualified board examination structure to look more like the way we examine as arts therapists in our programs. I've tried my hardest to make it as supportive as possible so that people don't feel like they don't know where to go, what to do. Obviously, there's always teething problems along the way. We've established quite a good network and a set of evaluators who have been trained by the board and, examiners. So really trying to get a pool of people that we can call on to examine foreign qualified people who are also understanding of the board process. So that's also is an immense amount of work and a big process, but I think we're getting there, and it's a lived document, it's a lived experience, so we're always refining according to what works or what doesn't. So I think that's been a big thing as well.
So just to thank you first, Tammy, for all the effort and the hard work for bringing those processes over the last few years to fruition. It's a huge achievement, and thank you so much for doing that. I think the last question that I have for you is perhaps just understanding the role of yourself as our HPCSA rep to our association, to SANATA. And that is something that you and I have been talking about over the last few years, and really starting to understand that a little bit more. You know, this idea that you come from us, but you are actually part of the board representing us, but actually SANATA represents arts therapists and needs to advocate and engage the board. So it might be just helpful to hear a little bit more about how you understand that process, which I think will be helpful to our members and, you know, whoever else is going to be watching this.
Yes. That certainly, like you say, Mish, has taken time to kind of wrap our heads around. I think as you kind of understand how these board structures work, you also begin to understand governance and what that is in relationship to sort of a council structure. And that's as a member of the board, my responsibility is to that board, and I have to adhere to its governance structures. And part of that is that I can't report board matters to another association or board. So because I am bound by the confidentiality, whatever, you know, all those structures of our board. So obviously, if there's anything SANATA wants to know, then SANATA requests to understand the how something is progressing, etc., from the board. So I think we've come to understand that my role is ex officio on the SANATA exec, but still important because I can come in with an understanding of how council works. I can offer advice, offer suggestions. I can come with that knowledge and that experience that can really support SANATA. I think that perhaps also another significant achievement is that SANATA has a very good working relationship with myself, with the board, and so has a much more developed presence. And SANATA is our representative. It is our recognized stakeholder of the arts therapies on the HPCSA. So as you've rightly said, SANATA needs to play the role of the mouthpiece and the advocate for the arts therapies and address issues, wants, desires, problem, whatever it is, directly with the board, and that gets tabled at meetings. And then obviously the stakeholder meeting is an important moment every year where all the stakeholders of the board are present in a stakeholder meeting and address concerns that they have, or etc. So I think that we're starting to really get that right. I think that we're really starting to understand how those two roles sit in relationship to each other, how they can work together. And you know, when I came onto the board, that was non-existent. It wasn't there. You know, it was like thumbsuck to get someone there, and then I would be whispering to the person, maybe you should ask this, you know. So it was we've come such a long way in the professionalization of our association, of our presence, of our representation, of our strategic goals and objectives. So I think that that's, of course, incredibly commendable and exciting because it's where we need to be. So, yeah.
Thank you. I would agree. I would say that, you know, this more formal relationship is also one that allows us to ask for things and ask the board to be accountable for certain things. But, you know, that needs to be done in a formal way. Then there's a requirement for a formal answer. And I think that's kind of what you're speaking to, is that the formalization of the relationship actually works in our favor. It may not appear so at first glance, but it actually does, and it's up to us as SANATA to really use that. So we are finding our way in learning how to do that. Tam, is there any last thing that you would like SANATA members to know, or that something, a piece of information or something that you would like to share that you think would add to their understanding of your role or how they can engage with you? Is there any last point that you'd like to make?
Yeah, I suppose for me, what feels quite important is very often, just in conversation or in sort of channels, there's often a comment like, I've tried to speak to everyone at the council and I can't, and for me that's problematic, because you need to know that your board is the board occupational therapy, medical aesthetics, and prosthetics and arts therapy. So your first point of call, should you not get what you want, for example, out of registration or whatever it is to contact your board, because they are the ones that are representing you, that are working for you. So there's no need to go around and round in circles, because these things can be addressed relatively easily or quicker without having that long process. Because registrations, for example, and that's the way sometimes a lot of the issues emerge for arts therapy, any practitioner for that matter, is its own system, is its own part or department that has its own management structure. So it's separate from the boards, but there's obviously a relationship internally in administration. And so when there are complications, come to your board. Let us help you. SANATA has it. I've recently sent it out on our groups, the list of contacts, so you know who the people are that you need to contact. So there's no need to go around in circles for weeks or months on end, because issues can be dealt with quite swiftly if we can step in, if it's not our management structure. So for me, that's a really important point, I think also if there's any kind of advocacy or additional things that one wants the HPCSA to play, or they need to come to a SANATA exec meeting. It needs to be tabled at SANATA, and that can be done. And SANATA will table it at an exec meeting and we will discuss it. And then I can also guide SANATA how they best sort of then approach the board or formalize that response.
Yes. I think that's important. If there is somebody that's unhappy with something, then the first port of call is not to complain to you, but to come to us and say, this is something that I believe that SANATA should take up. And then we table it at our executive meeting and we do that. So I think that's important to clarify.
And I think lastly, just to, like I've said earlier, any output about the arts therapies is my work, because council doesn't output things about its professions that are represented or registered with the board, because council is the boards. So there isn't some machine at council that's generating newsletters, that's generating e-bulletins, that those are the board representatives who are writing those things. I have to write an article for the magazine every quarter. I have to write any e-bulletin because I am the expert in my profession in that place, so any output that one sees in relationship to any of the professions is done by the members. So so just to understand that there's not some workhorse in the board who's generating information. It just, that's not how it works. So the output is the work of the board. So I think that's important to say.
Thank you, Tammy. Thank you very much for your time this morning, and I hope that our conversation has really provided some clarity to new and old members and members of the public that are going to maybe watch this at some point. So thank you so much for your time, and perhaps we'll have a second round of conversations another time to discuss further things. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Mish.